Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some trade news for the San Jose Sharks as they send forward Fabian Zetterlund to the Ottawa Senators. Now, today is trade deadline day. It has come and gone. There are no more deals to talk about, and earlier it seemed as though the only move that the Sharks would be making was sending Luke Kunin to the Columbus Blue Jackets in exchange for a fourth-round pick. Many of the other deals were instead made in the days leading up to the deadline. But as per usual, right before 3 p.m. Eastern, there are a few trades that managed to sneak their way through, and Mike Grier was one of those GMs doing so with this Fabian Zetterlund deal. Now, originally, when I saw this, I was not immediately taken aback. This was not something that completely upset me right out of the gate, because while I do view Zetterlund as a potential future piece for the Sharks, he wasn't part of that core group like Celebrini or Smith or Eklund would be. And with the Sharks desperately needing help on their blue line, especially with yesterday's trade for Jake Wallman, it would have certainly made a lot of sense if the Sharks decided to trade Zetterlund for some sort of defensive help. I floated the idea of a Brandt Clark trade yesterday. I mentioned how Mario Ferraro could be a piece going back to Los Angeles. Zetterlund would have also been an option in such a trade. But we saw that Zetterlund was instead heading to Ottawa, and the problem with the Senators roster is that they don't really have the type of defenseman that San Jose would be able to get from them. Their top prospect is Carter Yakimchuk, a righty who perfectly fits into the Sharks' situation, but it was unlikely that Ottawa would move on from him. And then of sorts their roster defensemen, guys like Jake Sanderson, Thomas Chabot, highly doubtful in their chase for the playoffs that they would be moving on from those players. And so there was a lot of nerves here about what this return would end up being, and those nerves turned pretty quickly into anger, because truly this Fabian Zetterlund trade ends up being the worst that Mike Grier has made as a San Jose Sharks general manager. It's not even remotely close. The only deal that could perhaps compete for that title is the Brent Burns trade from a few years ago, but at the very least that one had kind of a side goal of simply just getting out from under Burns' contract, and so even though the return was rather subpar, they managed to get $5.5 million off the books. This Zetterlund trade has no such redeeming quality to it. There is nothing to hang your hat on here. This is just straight up an awful move. Now, before I get into the assets here that end up getting moved either way, there is an important caveat that I do want to give. I know there are many San Jose Sharks fans who are a huge fan of Fabian Zetterlund. They really like this player, and so they would have grown attached to him and are upset to see him go. I am not one of those people. I mentioned earlier on that I didn't necessarily see Fabian Zetterlund as a future core piece of this group, and on top of that, I didn't even necessarily think Zetterlund was a fantastic player. A few days ago, I made my third quarter grades for the Sharks, and I had originally given Zetterlund a C, and I went so far as to say that he wasn't the type of player who really blew me away, and being not that type of play driver guy, I viewed him as much more so a really good third liner, which is still nice, but maybe a little bit lower what other people think. And so I'm not coming into this and saying, oh, Zetterlund, he should have gotten 17 first-round picks in return. I'm not trying to overvalue this player, but what the Sharks end up getting is well below his actual value. So let us start off on what the Sharks get, and the first is a second-round pick in 2025. Now, this is bad for multiple reasons. The first of which is what we have seen this year is that it is an extremely heavy seller's market. Teams are getting insane value for their rental players who would not normally trade for this amount of assets. Just a couple of hours ago, the Toronto Maple Leafs, in trying to keep pace with some of the other teams in the Atlantic Division, like the Lightning, who added Bjorkstrand and Gord, or the Panthers, who added Marchand and Seth Jones, they made a deal to acquire Philadelphia Flyers player Scott Laughton. Now, Laughton is a center, which is a pretty hefty advantage over someone like Fabian Zetterlund, not to be underestimated. But that is where the advantages completely end. Otherwise, Zetterlund is going to be putting up more points. He's going to be scoring more goals. He could likely play in a higher up role if necessary, if relatively effective on a power play unit. This is a player who's also built for the playoffs. Is he really that much worse than Scott Laughton? Honestly, you could probably make the argument he is a slightly better player, but even if not, the fact is that Laughton was able to get the Flyers not just a first-round pick, but also a pretty good prospect in Grebenkin from Toronto. And even worse, Laughton is an unrestricted free agent at the end of this year, which means the Maple Leafs will only be getting him for the rest of this season and the playoffs, and then he can just walk away. In the case of Zetterlund, he is a restricted free agent at the end of this season, which means it would be pretty easy for the Ottawa Senators to just hang on to him and keep him as a future piece of this team. He is not a rental player. So I cannot comprehend how the Flyers end up such massive winners in the Scott Laughton trade. Meanwhile, the Sharks, with a player with futures, ends up on such a losing side of this deal. The other reason that this second rounder is quite bad is that it is in 2025, and I have mentioned in previous video that this year's draft is expected to be pretty bad, at least as you move later on into it. We have seen so many teams thus far at the deadline instead targeting 2026 or even 2027 draft picks, not wanting to pick players deep in the draft this season. And so people have gone so far as to say that second rounders in 2025 are the equivalent of third rounders in other previous and future draft years. And so this second rounder, while it may seem good-ish on paper, it is actually a decent bit worse than that in reality. And so there is no good redeeming quality from this second rounder. But let's move further down the list. Obviously, this is not the only asset the Sharks are getting back. The next is forward Noah Gregor. Sharks former forward Noah Gregor. And you want to know the reason for why he is a former Sharks player? It is because Mike Grier himself let him walk away a couple of years ago. He did not feel as though Noah Gregor was good enough to crack that San Jose Sharks roster, and I don't even necessarily blame him for that decision. I liked Gregor, but I didn't think he was a key piece, and in the couple of years that he has been gone, not much has actually changed. He is still at best just an okay fourth liner. So the fact that the Sharks let him walk away for free and are now paying a really solid roster player to get him back is not good asset management, something that we have seen Grier be very good with dealing with in the past few years. But the final player on this list, Zach Ostapchuk, is supposed to be the centerpiece of this deal, the young, promising prospect here. And I thought when I saw this name, I didn't recognize it, and I was hoping and crossing my fingers, please be a right-handed defenseman who is really good. But he is the exact opposite of that. He is not a defenseman, he is a forward, and he isn't even particularly good. This is a player who could perhaps end up being a fourth liner. It has a good chance of being a fourth liner, but not even necessarily much more than that. Now, on the surface, you look at Ottawa Senators related people talking about him, and they'll have the grading of the Senators prospect pool. He'll be number 3, number 4, which will seem really, really solid. You know, if the Sharks traded away their third or fourth best prospect, someone would be getting Quinton Musty or Igor Chernyshov, which would be an outstanding win for them. But the Senators have one of the worst prospect pools in the entire league. And so getting a third or fourth best player on that list is not actually a win. To talk about some of the blurbs that were said about this player, one of them was, you'll be happy if this player scores 30 points in a year in the NHL. Another was that he's going to end up being a worse version of the Barclay Goodrow that won a Stanley Cup with Tampa Bay. Now, this isn't to be mean to this player. Again, he could end up being a fourth liner, maybe even a third liner, but that seems to be his ceiling. You're not really going to get anything more than a pretty good third liner. And I already mentioned earlier on that Fabian Zetterlund already has proven himself to be a really good third liner, even on last place San Jose Sharks team. What could he have possibly done on an actual good Sharks team? Well, we'll never know, because instead we have now traded him away for a player who at best will end up being a worse version of Fabian Zetterlund. And so when you combine these three assets together, there aren't actually any positives here. It just feels like a loss at every possible turn. And yet it gets even worse than this. We continue to pile on onto this trade because it would be one thing if it was Zetterlund who was traded straight up for this second rounder in 2025, Noah Gregor and Zach Ostapchuk. That would already be a bad deal and the worst by Mike Grier by a mile. But it is not even just a straight up trade. The Sharks have actually added to this package. They have Tristan Robbins here, who admittedly isn't really a big loss for San Jose. He had been leapfrogged by like a dozen players within the Sharks system and is maybe just used to kind of make the roster numbers work out here, 2 players for 2 players. But the Sharks have also sent over a 4th round draft pick. Now, the full details of this trade at the time of filming are not completely settled, so I don't know if this is a 2025 4th, a 2026 4th. It could possibly even be a 2040 4th. That is not the point of this deal. The point being is that the Sharks felt as though Zetterlund, for these 3 players, they needed to add value to what they were offering to Ottawa to actually make this work, when even the Zetterlund for these 3 players, or these 3 assets, was already awful. The Sharks have added to that to make it even worse. Like, it just doesn't really make any sense how this deal came to be. The only possible thing that I have seen that you could maybe say is with the fact that Zetterlund is a free agent at the end of this year, but he, as I mentioned, is not a UFA. He's not just going to walk and sign a contract with, the Buffalo Sabres at the end of this year, and that's that, and the Sharks lose out. He was an RFA, which means the Sharks could sign him. They could give him a qualifying offer. And even if they were very far apart in terms of contract negotiations, the Sharks wanted to give him $3 million, but he wanted $5 million, I highly doubt that Zetterlund would be willing to sit out games next year because of these types of contract disputes. I imagine something would have been able to be worked out at some point. If Zetterlund were to sign an offer sheet with a different team, the Sharks could end up just choosing to match it. This was not a zero-sum moment here for the Sharks where he could just leave. The Sharks had very heavy control of Zetterlund's future, and so it doesn't really seem to resonate with me that, the contract situation was so bad that they had to get rid of him. Even if Zetterlund walked up to Mike Grier and said, you know what, I hate it in San Jose, I hate playing here, I hate my teammates, which we know is not really true because he was best buds with William Eklund, but let's imagine this crazy scenario where somehow this was the case, and he mentioned, I refuse to sign with San Jose. Is this really the best trade that the Sharks could actually pull off? Reminder that they are not on a timer here because, again, Zetterlund cannot just walk in free agency. If they truly felt rushed, they could let the deadline pass and make a move at this year's draft because they have Zetterlund, they have the full control, they have his rights. There was no reason to make a rush on this particular deal. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and I cannot possibly find the reasoning for why this deal ends up getting made. There's just nothing actually here, and this does end up shaking the confidence that one would have in Mike Grier, who has otherwise navigated this rebuild rather well. He's made some great moves. The Erik Karlsson trade, the Timo Meier trade, the Yaroslav Askarov trade, these are objectively good moves for the San Jose Sharks. But this trade is so bad that it does make you wonder what type of moves he's going to be able to make in the future, because the fact is that Mike Grier thus far has resided over this Sharks team during the tear down portion of the rebuild. And the fact is that tearing down a team and building one that is designed to just lose game after game is actually not that difficult. Just get rid of all of your good players. But in actually building that team back up to not just be in the playoffs, but be competitive for a Stanley Cup, that is where the true challenge comes. And if he is willing to look at this Zetterlund trade on paper and say, this is good value, what else is going to end up getting done into the future that is actually going to end up being really, really bad? And so it's definitely a huge head scratcher, an awful trade, the worst that he has made for sure, and you're a little bit shaky and nervous now about what yet is to come, let's say, this offseason. Class dismissed.